Hi Booktube, it's Amy. I'm here to continue on with my series of videos on Honoré de Balzac. Now, where I had left things a couple of weeks ago in one of my Friday reads is that I had said I was going to sort of reassess in my own mind why I was reading Honoré de Balzac at all and why I want to read Balzac, because it had become a little bit foggy in my own mind and I was struggling to find the motivation to return to that 25 volume set that I bought in late May, early June of 2020. I was struggling to return to those and find the motivation to continue on. And so I spent some time thinking about Balzac and I dug into the Stefan Zweig biography of Balzac that was published in 1946 and really did some thinking about why Balzac's writings would be valuable specifically to me and to my reading life and my reading goals. And I should probably note that this is a biography that was published in French initially, and it was actually published after Zweig's death, and this particular translation is by William and Dorothy Rose, and it's quite a well-known biography of Balzac. It's one I had read several years ago, quite accessible, but the only thing I really recalled about it, coming back to it, was Balzac's garret and his love of coffee. So I was definitely due for a reread, for a reassessment of his life. And I did enjoy rereading this particular biography over my Christmas holidays. And the author, Zweig, approaches Balzac from the perspective that he was a genius, that he was someone who was always a genius, was always going to be a writer as long as he, took the effort to achieve it. And he calls him several times throughout this biography a genius, but we also get this other opposing view of Balzac as a failure in some ways, as someone who really struggled and who, rather than having, the spark of genius from birth, built it through his craft. And I think I would more agree with that assessment of Balzac as someone who wrote these wonderful literary works, not through some spark of genius, but because he took the time to really develop his craft. And Zweig talks about the many, potentially hundreds, possibly up to 1,000 works of literature that Balzac published in his early days as a writer under pseudonyms. He was in the habit of sort of churning out these formulaic mechanical novels, formulaic mechanical pieces of literature, if you want to call it literature, probably more along the lines of genre fiction in its day. But he was in the habit of churning these out to be published under pseudonyms for set prices. And he got into that at the start because he needed to earn a living. He was told by his family that he had 2 years to live in this garret in Paris and try out this writer thing. And the way Zweig describes it, his mother purposely picked the dingiest and worst and most uncomfortable garret she could find to sort of discourage him in this pursuit of writing, this pursuit of being an author, with the hopes that he would be so uncomfortable that he would come home, come to his senses, and continue on in his career as a lawyer, which is what he had trained for. It's what the family had sort of sunk their limited resources into. But in fact, he did not. Lucky for us, that's how we came to have the work that is the human comedy. Lucky for us, he did not. And instead of returning to his family, returning to the work as a lawyer and returning to a more conventional career path, he pursued writing through this work, churning out these works under pseudonyms, most of them which are lost, and the majority of them which can't actually be identified as works of Balzac. But that is to say, by the time he came to publishing under his own name, he had been training, per se, for several years. And so I think you can set aside the idea of him being a genius and rather look at him as a writer who learned his craft over many years. And there is this conflicting picture of his character as someone who was extremely intelligent and able to write these fantastic works, and someone who really wasn't a very practiced or disciplined person at all. He was very disciplined in his writing and his writing schedule, writing through the night, staying to this strict schedule, churning out these works, largely in a formulaic way. And this other side of him who was not very disciplined at all. Certainly with money, he was constantly in debt, constantly living beyond his means, almost like a character from one of his own books, the character who has this idea of who they want to be in society and thinks that they can buy their way there. And Balzac doesn't seem to have ever learned his lesson because he was constantly in debt, constantly trying to buy his way into a certain social status, into the aristocracy, really, but not really achieving those, dreams of the grand life. He built himself a house he couldn't afford. He was constantly furnishing apartments he couldn't afford, buying clothing he couldn't afford. In fact, ridiculous clothing so opulent that he didn't fit into the literary social circles, the salons that he was invited to, because his clothing was so opulent and ridiculous, but he wasn't of a high enough social status to get into those aristocratic circles that he desired and was attempting to dress for. He made himself rather ridiculous by adopting the deux into Balzac, because the deux didn't belong to his family by right per se. Rather, it was something he adopted later in life as part of his literary persona, to sort of give himself this mystique and give himself this social status that he so desired. In fact, the family name was just Balzac, but he weaved together this story about previous ancestors actually being from the de Balzac line, and weaves together this story about his family having claimed it several generations ago and justifying his use of it, despite his parents not using it and it appearing nowhere on his birth certificate or in his family lineage or records. And so he was this very opulent character who went about, in this carriage with that de Balzac coat of arms on the door, who went about in these ridiculous opulent clothes that didn't fit in with the social circle that he was able to achieve. And he went around spending all this money in a very undisciplined manner, constantly running from debt collectors. And yet there was the other side of him, the writer side, that was disciplined, did enable him to sort of churn out these many, many works over the course of a relatively small number of years. He didn't get started writing until he was in his 20s, and he really stopped writing in middle age because he died in middle age, probably from the effects of a poor lifestyle and exhaustion. Some people speculate the effects of all that coffee he drank on his digestion, but all that aside, he died relatively young, but left a massive body of work, which brings me to my thinking around why I want to read Balzac at all. Certainly, I've read a few of his works in the past. I've read Perigorio, I've read Cousin Bet. I have not read Lost Illusions, but that one is certainly top on my list. And I've dipped into some of his lesser known works, but I got this desire earlier in the year to approach his work as a whole, to approach his human comedy from start to finish. And by start to finish, I mean in the order in which the set I purchased, the 25-volume set, is set out. And I had these grand plans to begin with the first volume and read a volume a month. and I began that in June, and I am still on the first volume with one novella/novel left to read in this set. And so, as I said, I lost some motivation to be reading that Balzac. I got wrapped up in other things, and I found it difficult to return to it because I had lost sight, or perhaps I'd never correctly identified for myself where the value in it was for me. And so I set out 3 questions to ask myself about what I read, to ask myself about reading Balzac. So first of all, there is the why, there is the so what, and there is the now what. And the why is really those primary fundamental questions. Why would anyone possibly read Honoré de Balzac? And so there are the obvious answers. You read Balzac because his writing is interesting, it's enjoyable. You read Balzac because he paints an interesting picture of the society that he lived in. And then there is, for me, the primary reason, the reason that crowns all reasons why I would be reading Honoré de Balzac. And the answer to that is really that he had a significant impact on many, many authors that came after him, a significant impact on the novel as we know it today, and on sort of the canon of Western literature that came after him. And so you had authors like Simone de Beauvoir reading Balzac, you had Henry James reading Balzac, you had Flaubert reading Balzac, and each of these authors were impacted in some way by reading the works of Honoré de Balzac. And I did a little bit of digging of my own. Let me just pull up my notes here. But I was really able to sort of formulate my thoughts on this last night as I was reading the student diary of Simone de Beauvoir, where at the age of 18, she references Honoré de Balzac. So she had read many of the works of Balzac by the time that she was 18. And she takes note in her August 16th, 1926 diary entry of Balzac and is using him as sort of a piece of her exploration of the place that philosophy has in relation to literature. And so she is making a comparison between the works of Balzac and the works of another author by the name of Friedenthal, who I'm not familiar with. But she makes a distinction between the psychology that appears in Balzac's work, and at this point in time, if she's talking about psychology, she would have seen it as part of the discipline of philosophy. And so she's looking at psychology as an element of the philosophy that she's studying. But she says that Balzac sees man in time and space rather than as pure duration. And she spends a lot of time in her diary in this period looking at sort of the two sides of being, being within time and space in an individual moment, and the being in duration, the being as you see yourself internally, and the being as other people see you. And so it was very interesting to me to see her pulling Honoré de Balzac in, and it's something that I want to continue to look at as I work my way through her diaries, and perhaps as I reread her works later on, because I am seeing already the potential influence of Marcel Proust's work in her diary and her internal thoughts. And it's just very interesting to look at these later writers and to be able to pick out the influence. And Marcel Proust as well was heavily influenced by the works of Balzac, and it's commonly supposed that Balzac's characters and the way he wrote his characters had a direct influence on the way that Proust created and framed his characters. And although I haven't read certain works of Balzac yet, it is supposed that there are parallels between some of Proust's characters and some of Balzac's characters. And I, of course, have read through Proust's In Search of Lost Time, and I would be very interested on a future reread to sort of look for those Balzacian influences. And then Henry James as well. From what I understand, Henry James was a big proponent of Balzac and referred to him as the father of the modern novel. And I came across this lecture, this talk that Henry James gave on Balzac, on why we should read Balzac. Henry James describes Balzac as the father of all of us, the father of all novelists that came after him, and the writer that one must study, and the writer that, by being studied, can save the novel from its waste. He says this about Balzac's novels. He says, their immediate presence causes our ideas, whether about life in general or about the art they have exemplified in particular, to revive and breathe again, to multiply more or less, to swarm. His works, Henry James says, offers the critical spirit this opportunity for a certain intensity of educative practice. And so he's saying that Balzac's novels offer some of the best there is to be seen in novels, and they offer the opportunity for education, not only in our understanding of novels, but in our personal life. And so there is significant evidence of many authors being significantly influenced by the novels of Honoré de Balzac. And for that reason, I think that The Human Comedy is worth reading. So that answers the why, more or less. I want to read Balzac because he's had a profound influence on Western literature. But the what? When I come to the so what question, I ask myself, well, so what? So what if he's had an influence on Western literature? What am I going to understand from reading him? Well, hopefully, when I've read the entire Human Comedy, I will have a full, or as full as possible, an understanding of what his Human Comedy is all about and what he is trying to express through the writing of those works. And I'll also have some understanding of the society that Balzac lived in. And so that is sort of what I will achieve having read Balzac. I'll know what his Human Comedy is all about, and I'll know more about the society he lived in. So I'll know about his work, his writings. And then I come to the now what question. So once I've read that Human Comedy, what do I do with my knowledge? And I think the answer to this question is something I've already alluded to in my discussion of the works of Simone de Beauvoir and Proust. I'll be able to understand the impact, or part of the impact at least, that Balzac had on the writers that came after him. And the next question, of course, is what am I going to do now that I have a rationale in my own mind for reading Balzac? Well, I'm going to pick up where I left off earlier this year with volume 1 of my 25-volume set of Balzac. And I'm going to read Letters of Two Brides, which is the final work in this volume that I've not yet read. I'm going to read that, and I'm going to come back to you with a video focused on that final work, and then I will proceed at my own pace through the remaining 24 volumes. There is no set schedule, so unfortunately, if you're looking to read along, that isn't really something I'm focused on. I'm focused on my own personal understanding and journey through Balzac, and perhaps these videos can serve as some conversation after you yourself have read these works, if you so choose. So something to be watched after the fact, or perhaps something to even inspire you to pick up the works of Balzac. So thank you for bearing with me through my little ramble and little crisis here as I try to determine my motives for reading.